daily routine. Earlier tonight, I got off work. I went for a run. Actually, before I went for a run, I sparred with my partner, and I taught them that when somebody pushes your hand against your body, you should come over with an elbow. And they sure did. And they got me, cut my eyebrow. I was so proud. They cut my eyebrow with their elbow on the first try. So, that's how we do. But yeah, we train hard. So we're going to be listening to some audiobooks while we do my daily routine of martial arts, workout, yoga, and maybe some reading and meditation. I'm getting started a little late here. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and play this audiobook, and then I'm going to go get my notebook and get started. I have to get the charging cord for this thing too.
In 1908, a Japanese ship on the Pearl River in Guangdong was caught smuggling arms into China. The authorities of the Qing dynasty, which nominally ruled China at that time, seized the arms and the vessel. The Japanese government protested this, and eventually the Qing caved in. They compensated the smugglers for the arms, and they released their ship in an extravagant ceremony involving a 21-gun salute, among other things. And this incident ignited a firestorm of protest against both Japanese imperialism and the Qing government. This was just one of many imperialist outrages that China suffered during the so-called Century of National Humiliation, which passed between the end of the First Opium War, 1839 to 42, and the Chinese Revolution, which kicked imperialism out of China in 1949. And this was not by any means the worst of these imperialist crimes. It was certainly not the most significant. And so the question that you may all be asking is, why did I bother mentioning it? And the reason is that what happened is that there were some dock workers in Guangzhou, which is the capital of Guangdong, and Hong Kong, which is a city nearby. And in the wake of this incident, they refused to handle Japanese cargo. And as far as I've been able to find, this is the first time that Chinese workers engaged in collective action as workers. That is to say, they used their particular position in the process of production and exchange to advance a political goal. And just 17 years after this incident, China would be gripped by one of the most astounding proletarian uprisings of the 20th century. This was a process in which strikes became general strikes became insurrections, peasants made war against their landlords, and the Chinese nation, which had bowed its head before the power of Western capital for 8 decades, made its first attempt to stand up. And in this revolution, the Chinese working class came within striking distance of taking power. And this is an absolutely blistering historical pace, right? From the first inklings of class consciousness all the way to an all-out revolutionary struggle in just 17 years. And I think to understand how the Chinese workers' movement developed so quickly, it's necessary to take a look at how capitalism developed in China. And the story really starts with something that should be very familiar to us, a deep imbalance in world trade. So pre-capitalist China exported commodities all over the world. These were things like tea and porcelain and silk. And the only payment that the Chinese accepted was silver. The Chinese never really used gold as a currency. But China hardly ever imported anything from the rest of the world. And what this means is that all that silver, which was being used to buy Chinese goods, was staying in China, right? It didn't circulate back into the rest of the world economy. And so, in the 18th and 19th century, merchants actually developed a kind of saying about this. They said, China is where silver goes to die. And, despite the fact that the Spanish colonialists had looted enormous quantities of silver from Latin America over 3 centuries, by the early 19th century, the world economy was literally running out of silver. And it was in this context that the British capitalists decided, we've got to bring China into the world market. We've got to find something that they will buy with all this silver. And they did so with the most appalling methods imaginable. Then, as now, the Brits are a nation addicted to tea, and British capital found something even more addictive to import into China. That is opium, which they produced in their Indian colony and which they imported and sold into China. Of course, the Qing government and all of Chinese society very quickly became very unhappy about this. Obviously, this was a drug which totally was disintegrating society. And so there were 2 wars that were fought by the British with the assistance of the French, the 2 Opium Wars, which opened China and the Chinese market to foreign trade. In these wars, which China lost, the Qing were forced to conclude a series of unequal treaties with the imperialist powers. These not only legalized the opium trade, but they opened Chinese coastal and river ports to all foreign trade and limited Chinese tariffs to a nominal 5%. They also granted the right of extraterritoriality to foreign citizens of the big powers. This is the right of these citizens to be tried in foreign courts instead of in Chinese courts. And they granted a series of concessions to the big foreign powers. And these were sections of important Chinese cities which were entirely under their control. So, for example, my grandfather grew up in Shanghai, and he lived in a place called the French Concession, which was controlled by the French, and he went to school in a place called the International Settlement. And it's like kind of a nice name, like, isn't that a lovely place to live, the International Settlement? But actually what this was the part of Shanghai which was controlled by British imperialism. And it was international in the sense that they cut the Americans and some other powers in on some of the profits. So Marxists would come to describe China as semi-colonial. And what they meant by this is that China as a whole was not colonized the way India was, the way a lot of countries in Africa were. And the reason why was that the big powers were not prepared in the 19th and early 20th centuries to fight it out amongst themselves over who's going to colonize China. Instead, what they did was they divided the country up between themselves through diplomatic agreements, through these unequal treaties. And so you had not only Britain, France, Japan, and the United States, but also powers like Italy, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Tsarist Russian Empire. They all take control over various bits of China. And what they do with this control is to force China onto the world market. And so Western goods start flooding in, and very quickly they destroy traditional Chinese industries like textiles and porcelain production. And imperialist domination deepened even further around the turn of the 20th century. There was a treaty which ended the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, and this established the right of foreigners to build industrial plants in China. And so not only do you have foreign manufactured goods flooding into China, now you have foreign capital flooding into China, eager to exploit cheap Chinese labor. So in the course of only a few generations, the entire class structure of Chinese society was completely upended. A new class arose in China. These were the so-called compradors. And these were merchants and Qing officials who acted as the local agents and brokers of foreign capital on the Chinese market. And these people were able to amass great fortunes. Obviously, they didn't make nearly as much as the foreign capitalists who they were serving, but they still made substantial amounts of money. And the question that these people these compradors have is, what are we going to do with this money? Where are we going to invest it? And so they try in the late 19th century to found Chinese-owned banks and to start Chinese-owned factories. But what they find in this process is that they're not actually able to compete with Western capitalism or Japanese capitalism. They cannot, bring to bear the amount of capital that the foreign powers are able to bring, and Chinese industry is not able to compete with superior Western technique. So they're blocked on developing, industrial capital in China. So they've got to put their money somewhere. So instead of building up Chinese industry, these compradors invest in land. And this is a very natural move for this class because a lot of the compradors actually come from landlord families. If you were a Chinese landlord, you might send one of your sons into the city to get involved in the lucrative trade of compradoring. And so they take this wealth that they get, acting as the middlemen for foreign capital, and they amass these huge estates in the Chinese countryside. And that causes an epidemic of landlessness and poverty among the peasants. So by the time of the Revolution of 1925, 55% of Chinese peasants were entirely without land. Another 20% held a little bit of land, but not enough even for subsistence agriculture. Overall in China in 1925, over 81% of the land was in the hands of just 13% of the population. And then in areas like Guangdong and the Yangtze Valley, where imperialism was the strongest, things were even worse. So in some of these places, just 3% of the population would own 80% of the land. And these compradors, they weren't only absentee landlords, but they also tended to be usurers. You've got all these peasants who are totally impoverished. In order to just survive, they've got to borrow money, and the compradors lend it out to them at really appalling interest rates. And the devastation of the Chinese countryside also contributes to the formation of the Chinese working class. So you've got peasants who are driven out of the countryside because they're not able to pay their rents, they're not able to pay their debts, and they become raw material for exploitation in the new Chinese factories where they're working alongside urban and village artisans whose traditional small-scale production methods couldn't compete with Western manufacturing. And the Chinese working class explodes. So by the time of the revolution, there are nearly 3 million industrial workers in China, which doesn't necessarily sound like a lot, but when you think, a few generations before, generation and a half before, there were almost zero industrial workers in China. It's a big, big change. And the working class in the kind of broadest sense is around 14 million. And these people labored in absolutely appalling conditions. You had men, women, and children toiling in factories for shifts of 14 hours a day, 16 hours a day, in some places 17 hours a day. And wages were sometimes as low as 8 cents a day. In addition to this, workers were routinely beaten by foremen. So when we think about the American labor movement, the early days, the Haymarket Martyrs, we often think of the demand for 8-hour workday, right? If you look at the early Chinese labor movement, one of the demands that you see over and over again is a 12-hour workday and an end to physical punishment on the job. Now, there were also some, small homegrown Chinese capitalists who were still trying to compete with the big imperialist capital. And they did so by imposing even worse wages and conditions. And so you had, in a lot of these smaller factories, an apprentice system. And what it meant to be an apprentice was that you were a child worker who was working in conditions more akin to slavery than to wage labor. The shifts were as long as 18 hours a day, sometimes 20 hours a day, and payment could be as little as a bowl of rice and a board to sleep on. And so obviously under these conditions, the Chinese masses revolted against the horrors of capitalism from the very beginning, really. In 1850, just 8 years after the end of the First Opium War, the Taiping Rebellion broke out. And this rebellion lasted until 1864. It was one of the bloodiest civil wars of the 19th century. It took the lives of 30 million people, which was about 7% of the population pre-war. And in fact, if you look at the Chinese population, between war and famine and emigration, the Chinese population in 1925 is approximately the same as it had been in 1850. And, you know, the Taiping Rebellion, I would love to do a whole lead off on that. One of the most interesting events of the 19th century was led by this guy called Hong Xichuan. And he had a fever dream in which God appeared and told him, "You are my second begotten son, and consequently the half brother of Jesus Christ." But there's no time to get into it, except to say that the Taiping Rebellion was the last attempt to solve the problems of Chinese society via the traditional Chinese method, which was a peasant revolt. You know, when the peasants got too exploited, they would rise up, and if the uprising was strong enough, they would overthrow the old dynasty, and one of the peasant generals would proclaim himself to be the new emperor. There'd be a little bit of reform. They would take the boot off the neck just a little bit, and then things would continue again and get worse and worse and worse until there was another uprising. And if it had just been a question of overthrowing the Qing dynasty, the Taiping Rebellion certainly would have succeeded. The Qing forces were just as incapable of defeating the rebellion as they had been incapable of defeating the British in the Opium Wars. But the Qing tried to deal with this by encouraging provincial governors to raise their own armies, essentially. Now, these armies were not any more successful than the main Qing armies, but what it did do was set the stage for warlordism in China, because these armies, many of them never demobilize, and in fact, they keep getting new recruits from landless peasants who they need a job, they need something to do. And so this sets the stage later on for the problem of warlordism, which wasn't really solved until 1949. But ultimately, the rebellion was only defeated by the British and French forces who intervened to prop up the declining Qing dynasty. And so you have a situation where, just as the comprador bourgeoisie emerges as the local agents for foreign capital, the warlords in the Qing, after the Taiping Rebellion, become kind of the local political agents of imperialist control. And so to summarize where we are at this point, by the second half of the 19th century, Chinese society was in deep crisis. The country was divided up and dominated by foreign capitalist powers. The decrepit Chinese ruling class was totally incapable of expelling these foreigners and unifying the country. And instead, the old ruling class was helping to enforce their rule. The majority of the peasantry was in a state of extreme privation. The Chinese bourgeoisie could not develop its own industry, could not consolidate control over its own internal market because of foreign competition. So in other words, China is ripe for a bourgeois revolution, right? China is ripe for a revolution that is going to achieve national independence, unify the country, reform land ownership, and establish democracy. So in 1894, there's a party founded to lead just such a revolution. Dr. Sun Yat-sen founded something called the Revived China Society, which would eventually come to be known as the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, sometimes referred to by its Latin initials KMT. And for a bit of trivia now, does anybody know which city the Kuomintang was founded in? Just shout it out if you know or if you have a guess. Yes. Yes, that's absolutely correct. It was founded, yeah, give it up. The Kuomintang was founded in Honolulu, Hawaii. And this is not an accident, right? The driving force behind Chinese nationalism was not the Chinese bourgeoisie, right? And how could it be? These people were the compradors. These people, their entire social position is based on their relationship to the imperialist bourgeoisie. Chinese nationalism really emerges among petty bourgeois elements. People who had been forced to emigrate because of the conditions in China, and they were living in Southeast Asia, they were living in the Pacific Islands, in Europe, and in America. In fact, you know, when the Xinhai Revolution breaks out in 1911, Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Kuomintang, is living in Denver. and he's got to get home as quickly as possible so that they can make him provisional president of the Republic of China. And this revolution in 1911 succeeded in overthrowing the Qing, who had ruled China since 1644, and it overthrew the entire imperial system, which had been in place since 221 BC. But it failed to solve all of the fundamental problems of Chinese society. It did not unify the country. In fact, Sun was quickly replaced as president by a warlord who tried to proclaim himself a new emperor. Didn't really work out, but there was also no land reform, right? The peasants did not get land. The big landlords remained in place. Imperialism continued to dominate China. But the imperialists are no longer able to govern through the Qing, and so the rival imperialist powers are only able to back various warlords who rule various parts of the country, while, as I've said, the big powers control directly various concessions in the most important places. And by the early 1920s, the Kuomintang only controls a small part of China, centered around Guangzhou, a very important industrial and commercial city in the south. But overall, after the First Revolution, things continued much as before. So underneath the surface, a new force was emerging, which had the potential to succeed where the party of the bourgeoisie, the Kuomintang, had failed. And this is the Chinese working class movement, which is starting to develop. So during the First World War, the British and the French actually recruit about 200,000 Chinese workers to go to Europe and serve doing manual labor behind the lines of the Western Front. And these workers, they come into contact for the first time with the European labor movement. They come in contact with the socialist movement. They see the different conditions that workers have in Europe compared to in China. And after the war in 1918, these workers come home, and some of them found the first trade unions in China. You also have, of course, in 1917, the October Revolution, which is a tremendous inspiration to the Chinese working class, but also to a layer of liberal intellectuals. China had supported the victorious side in the First World War, and a lot of these people, particularly liberal intellectuals, they expect we supported the winning side. They're going to do something for us after the war. We're going to be rewarded. But of course, they got nothing of the sort. In the imperialist Treaty of Versailles, Germany's holdings in China were not given back to the Chinese, they were given to the Japanese. And so not just Chinese workers, but a whole broad section of Chinese society could compare what the imperialists were doing with the Karakhan Manifesto of 1919, where the Soviet Republic renounced all of the territory that the Russian Empire had taken in China and relinquished all of the rights that Russia had obtained under the unequal treaties. And so a broad swath of Chinese society is actually very well disposed towards communism. And they look at it and they say, here's a force that's serious about fighting imperialism, serious about fighting for the rights of oppressed nations. And this, comes to the fore in the May 4th movement of 1919, which was sparked by student protests against the Chinese government's acquiescence to the Treaty of Versailles. The leader of the May 4th movement was a guy called Chen Duxiu, who was the editor of New Youth magazine, which was a publication that championed science and democracy against traditional Chinese culture. And in this movement, Sun was arrested. And when he finally got out of jail, he decided, we've got to found a Chinese Communist Party. And he started that process, which culminated on July 1st, 1921. The party was founded at a conference in Shanghai. There were 12 delegates present, and they represented maybe 50 or 60 members nationwide. And the party politically had a very auspicious start. The party declared that it had four main aims. Number one, to overthrow the bourgeoisie with a revolutionary army of the proletariat and to rebuild the state with the toiling classes. Two, to introduce a dictatorship of the proletariat in order to achieve the goal of class struggle and end to classes. Three, to destroy the system of bourgeois private property and expropriate machines, land, factory, and the means of production. And four, to ally with the Third International. And I think we have to say that this is pretty good for a brand new workers' party in a country that barely has trade unions. In fact, it's much more politically advanced than the early workers' parties in Western Europe. And, you know, we always raise the demand, you know, that the labor leaders or Bernie Sanders or Zoran Mandami, these people should break with the Democrats and form a workers' party. But we always caution people to say that if they were to do this, it would be a reformist party. It would have a pretty terrible program. It would be a long struggle to actually have a communist program. You know, imagine Zoran decides tomorrow that he's going to break with the Democrats, and he comes out with his program, and it's, you know, to overthrow the bourgeoisie with a revolutionary army of the proletariat, to have a dictatorship of the proletariat. Right? This is not going to happen. So how was it that China's first Workers' Party starts on such a high political level? And I think this is really a lesson in dialectics and the development of class consciousness. Right? The ideas in our head are more or less imperfect reflections of the material world, the nature and the society in which we live. But human consciousness necessarily has to lag behind real developments, and human consciousness is inherently conservative. But the development of capitalism in China was at a much faster pace than in Europe and North America, where bourgeois society develops gradually over the course of centuries in a comparatively smooth process. And when you have a comparatively gradual process, the old ideas, which are gradually becoming less and less a reflection of reality, are easier to hang on to than if things happen suddenly. And Trotsky actually raises this point in a talk in 1924, a year before the revolution breaks out, called Perspectives and Tasks in the East, where he's talking about the possibility of revolutions in places like China. And he said, when economic factors intrude in a revolutionary way, cracking the old regime, when development takes place not gradually, not organically, but by means of terrible shocks and abrupt shifts, then critical thought finds its revolutionary expression incomparably more easily and rapidly. And I will say parenthetically that this is very relevant to us today. You know, the rise of American capitalism was a relatively long process over centuries, relatively gradual. But in case you missed the morning session yesterday, the decline of American imperialism is unfolding very rapidly. And this is already having a big effect on consciousness. And the fact is, we haven't seen anything yet. And just take a look at the effect that these abrupt shifts have in China. In just under 4 years, this party of 60 comrades would be thrown into the cauldron of a revolution. It would grow to be a party of tens of thousands, leading trade union organizations of millions of workers. And it would have the opportunity to take power and fulfill its revolutionary program. This is a party which had developed from being founded in the summer of 1921 to a revolution in the spring of 1925. And I ask everybody in here to consider, you know, our party was founded in the summer of 2024. We were many times larger than the Chinese Communist Party. So basically, buckle up for the spring of 2028. No. Stop. No. Obviously, we can't be so mechanical. But the point is that this incredibly new party, with very little experience, very few cadre, is called upon in a very short period of time to play a massive historical role. And how is it possibly going to be able to rise to the challenge? And I think the Communist Party has one factor which should have worked in its favor. You know, in 1925, it's only 4 years old, but it was part of an international, the Communist International, which was led by the Bolshevik Party, which had developed over a much longer period of time, starting with the earliest Marxist circles in Russia in 1883. This was a party that had led a successful proletarian revolution in 1917, and the Comintern could help transmit to the CCP the whole of the Marxist tradition, which had been developing since the 1840s, and which could prove a very effective guide to action for the party. In fact, only Marxism could really explain the failure of the revolution of 1911, and the perspectives and tasks for the second coming Chinese Revolution. And Marxists began by understanding that the Chinese Revolution was first and foremost going to be a revolution against imperialism. Its most immediate tasks, national independence, unifying the country, breaking up the massive estates of the big landlords, and distributing the land to the poor peasants, these are tasks which, in the West, had been accomplished in the classical bourgeois revolutions. Think about England in 1649, think about France 1789, think about the United States in our two bourgeois revolutions. And these were all national revolutions which united all the classes in society behind the leadership of the bourgeoisie. But such a development was impossible in the case of China, as it had been in Russia and as it was in other backwards countries. And why is that so? Because the real interests of the Chinese bourgeoisie are totally at odds with the task of the bourgeois revolution in China. So Lenin and Trotsky, very early on, before the Russian Revolution, had identified the agrarian question, the question of how do we get land to the peasants, as the key driver of the Russian Revolution. And the exact same thing was true in the Chinese Revolution. Now, in Europe, historically, the bourgeoisie had developed in the cities in opposition to and oppressed by the aristocracy, which controlled the land in the countryside and which was also oppressing and exploiting the peasantry. And so the European bourgeoisie could lead a revolution that expropriated the aristocracy. But in China, the comprador bourgeoisie had developed out of the old Chinese ruling classes. The urban capitalists in China were either foreign imperialists, or if they were Chinese, they were also the big landlords who dominated the countryside. So expropriating the big Chinese landlords meant, in essence, expropriating the Chinese bourgeoisie. And asking the Chinese bourgeoisie to lead the Chinese Revolution is basically asking the Chinese bourgeoisie to expropriate itself. Furthermore, the classical bourgeois revolutions occurred at a time when there was no other class which could compete with the bourgeoisie for leadership, right? All of the bourgeois revolutions involved in some way or another arming the peasantry, arming the urban poor. And in the 17th and 18th and 19th, even early 19th century in some places, the bourgeoisie can do this, right? Because there's no alternative class that is going to be able to push them aside and lead the revolution. There was no modern working class. But in China, in the 20th century, arming the workers and the peasants means arming a force, particularly the Chinese working class, that has trade unions developing, that has a communist party, that has the ability to have its own political position in the revolution, and which could potentially take leadership of the revolution. And so for these reasons, Marxists predicted that the Chinese bourgeoisie, far from being the leading class of the Chinese Revolution, would in fact be the leading class of counter-revolution in China. Far from leading a struggle against imperialism, the Chinese bourgeoisie would, when faced with a mass uprising of Chinese workers and peasants, look to make a deal with the imperialists. And as we shall see, this proved to be entirely correct. So the urban, bourgeoisie, or the Chinese comprador bourgeoisie, which lived in the cities but owned a lot of land in the countryside, they couldn't lead the revolution, but in fact the working class could, right? They were still a small minority of the population, but they held the key position in the process of production and exchange. And if they could cement an alliance with the peasantry, that would be enough. They would be able to take power. And there was every reason to believe that such an alliance could be struck in China the way it had been in Russia. Workers and peasants, to a great extent, in China shared the same enemy, right? The capitalist exploiters, both Chinese and foreign, were the same class which was ultimately responsible for the poverty and oppression of the peasants. Now, once in power, the Chinese workers would not want, nor would they be able to stop at just fulfilling the tasks of the bourgeois revolution. They would have to carry the revolution out to the end. They would have to overthrow the entire capitalist system. This revolution would be a beacon to the world working class, and with the help of revolutions in more advanced capitalist countries, the Chinese workers could begin to rebuild society along socialist lines. This, in short, is the theory of permanent revolution. It was developed in advance of the Russian Revolution, and Trotsky once said it was even more applicable to China than it had been in Russia, if such a thing were possible. But in order to lead the revolution, the first task of the young Chinese Communist Party is to win over the most advanced workers, the most advanced elements of the working class, win them to a revolutionary program, and organize them and train them as cadres who could win over the masses. I don't know if this sounds familiar to anybody, but the conditions for the Chinese Communist Party were extremely favorable to do so. The working class movement in China was developing at a rapid pace. As I said, the first trade unions were founded right after the First World War, but really mass trade unionism in China was a product of the Communist Party. In 1918, there were 25 strikes recorded in China involving less than 10,000 workers. By 1922, there were 91 strikes involving some 150,000 workers. And one of the most significant of these strikes of 1922 was in Hong Kong, which was a city entirely controlled by British imperialism ever since the First Opium War. And in January of 1922, 30,000 Hong Kong seamen struck for union recognition and a pay increase. And they held out for 8 weeks of bitter and bloody struggle. The British imperialist authorities were eventually forced to agree to all their demands. And the communists participated in this strike, and they raised their prestige among the working class by fighting alongside them. But the party was still very small. It was smaller than we are today. It was only a few hundred comrades. And so leadership of this strike fell not to the Communist Party, but to the KMT. And in the aftermath of victory, about 12,000 sailors in Hong Kong and Guangzhou and other places in China joined the Kuomintang. And, it's understandable why they would do this. This was China's oldest and largest political party. And despite its failures in the 1911 revolution, many Chinese people continue to see this as the leading party of the anti-imperialist and democratic struggle. So it's clear that the Communist Party has got to find a way to reach the workers who are attracted to the KMT and win them over to communism. The question was, how do we do this? So actually in the summer of 1920, before the CCP is even founded, the Second Congress of the Comintern held a commission on strategy and tactics of communists in the colonial and semi-colonial countries. And Lenin summarized the commission's findings in this way. He said, communists must enter into temporary alliance with bourgeois democracy in the colonial and backwards countries. But communists should not merge with it, and under all circumstances uphold the independence of the proletarian movement, even if it is in its most embryonic form. At the same time, Lenin stressed, it does not follow that the leadership of the revolution will have to be surrendered to the bourgeois democrats. On the contrary, the proletarian parties must carry on vigorous and systematic propaganda for the Soviet idea and organize peasants and workers' Soviets as soon as possible. In short, the strategy that the CCP needed was created, by the Comintern before the party was even founded. They needed to make a temporary united front with the KMT, but the purpose of this united front, the communists needed to use this united front as a way to expose the incapability of the bourgeois nationalists to lead the struggle against imperialism. And, the tragedy of the Chinese Revolution is ultimately rooted in the fact that these correct perspectives and this correct tactical approach were hideously distorted by the Soviet bureaucracy, which was in the process of consolidating its power in Russia and in the Comintern. Its tactical mistakes flowed fundamentally from mistakes in theory, right? Against the theory of permanent revolution, Stalin and the Comintern leaders returned to the old Menshevik theory of stages. So they argue that the Chinese Revolution is a bourgeois revolution. Therefore, the Chinese Revolution has got to be led by the bourgeoisie. The role of communists is not to lead the working class to power in the Chinese Revolution, it's to serve as a prop and support for the KMT. In fact, they go so far as to claim that the KMT is not really a bourgeois party at all. It's a four-class party comprising the peasantry, the working class, the urban petty bourgeoisie, and the national bourgeoisie. And there are two basic problems with this analysis. One is that you can't have a four-class party, right? No man could serve two masters, and much less can any party serve four masters. You've got four different classes with different class interests, and no party can represent all of them at the same time. And the second problem with this analysis is that there really is no national bourgeoisie in China. The Chinese bourgeoisie was entirely tied to its class brothers in the imperialist bourgeoisie. Now, they might have chafed at foreign oppression, like there was a lot of racism, and you know the Chinese bourgeoisie were held back from being a real ruling class and developing Chinese industry by the imperialist bourgeoisie. However, when it came down to it, they were going to be far more threatened by an uprising of Chinese workers and peasants than they would be by the oppression of the imperialist bourgeoisie. But unfortunately, Lenin was ill. He died in January of 1924. Trotsky was being politically isolated. And so the Comintern leaders, Stalin and Zinoviev, suggested that the Communist Party form a bloc within the Kuomintang. And the idea was that communists are going to join the KMT as individuals and help build it into a revolutionary party. They're going to, pressure the bourgeois leaders and push them to the left. And there was a lot of opposition in the Chinese party to the bloc within. Most members of the Chinese Communist Party, including the leaders like Chen Duxiu, they correctly saw the KMT as a reactionary force. But Stalin and Zinoviev leaned on the prestige of the International and leaned on their own prestige as having participated in the Russian Revolution to convince the Chinese party to go along. And so Trotsky was the only leading member of the Russian party and only leader of the Communist International to vote against the bloc within. But his viewpoint was suppressed. The Chinese didn't learn until much later of Trotsky's criticism of the Comintern policy. Now, at times, the bloc within was downright farcical. You know, the whole point of a united front with the KMT was to find a way to reach the workers who were attracted to the KMT. But you had some places in the country where the KMT doesn't have a presence, but the communists have a presence. And in those places, you had communists building branches of the Kuomintang so that they could then join those branches and carry out the bloc within. And despite all this help from the Chinese Communist Party, the Kuomintang leadership around Sun Yat-sen was not at all enthusiastic to have communist support. In the struggle for national independence, Sun preferred to rely on negotiations with the imperialists rather than a militant mass movement of workers and peasants. And this is exactly a confirmation of what Lenin and Trotsky had said about the bourgeoisie in backwards countries. They would rather find an accommodation with the imperialist bourgeoisie than rely on a mass movement which could get out of control and threaten their property and their position in society. So in order to help ease the bloc within along, the Soviets sweetened the deal. They provided the KMT with funds. They helped transform it from a loose, heterogeneous party into a disciplined, centralized force modeled on the Bolsheviks in form, if not in political content. They also supplied arms to create the military wing of the KMT, the National Revolutionary Army, the NRA. They also created a military academy staffed with Red Army experts to help train the officers. Eventually, in 1926, in the middle of the Chinese Revolution, they made the KMT an associate party of the Communist International, and they made Sun Yat-sen's successor, Chiang Kai-shek, an honorary member of the executive committee of the Comintern. So yeah, we are, I suppose, about 45 minutes in, and I will now actually talk about the Chinese Revolution. The bloc within was a tactical blunder, but it was not necessarily a decisive one. Despite its mistakes in theory and practice, the Chinese Communist Party was continuing to develop, and it was continuing to develop alongside the objective development of the Chinese workers' movement. So on May Day in 1924, 200,000 workers marched through the streets of Guangzhou. 100,000 workers marched through the streets of Shanghai. Even in cities under very tight warlord control, workers were having rallies, were flying the red flag. This is in a country, I will remind you, that 6 years previously did not have a single trade union. By May Day the next year, 1925, the CP-led unions had grown to some 570,000 members. They were in every major city in China. The Communist Party also had organized some peasant associations in the countryside in Guangdong. And these peasant associations, they were only in one province, but they had 200,000 members. And later that same month, some students and workers in Shanghai took to the streets. They were protesting some striking workers who were shot down in Qingdao, and also a Chinese worker in Shanghai had been beaten to death by a Japanese foreman. And so they go out and protest spontaneously. Some of them get arrested. And on the afternoon of May 30th, students and workers marched to a police station in the British-controlled international settlement of Shanghai and demanded their release. A British officer panicked in the face of mass demonstrations and ordered his troops to fire. 12 people were killed, and many, many more were wounded. And in response to this, a general strike erupted in Shanghai. The movement soon spread with general strikes and a boycott of British goods in Hong Kong and in Guangzhou. The Second Chinese Revolution had begun. The strike boycott movement in Hong Kong lasted for a full 18 months. According to the British governor of Hong Kong, the strike cost the British imperialists £250,000 British pounds a day. And in Shanghai and Guangzhou, the movement was even more developed. Workers were, in essence, in power on the streets. The strikers were organizing social services. They were enforcing order through their own tribunals. Harold Isaacs wrote a very important book about the Chinese Revolution. He described the movement in Guangzhou. He said, workers cleaned out gambling and opium dens and converted them into strikers' dormitories and restaurants. Every 50 strikers named a representative to a strikers' delegate conference, which in turn nominated 13 men to function as an executive committee. Under the auspices of this working-class body, the first embryo Soviet in China, a hospital and 17 schools for men and women workers and for their children were established. A strikers' court was set up, which tried offenders against the boycott and other disturbers of the public order. And so this is the situation on the ground. And for its part, the Kuomintang saw the mass movement as an opportunity to consolidate power. So in June of 1925, leaning on this mass movement, they established a national government with its capital in Guangzhou, the same city from the quotation that I just mentioned, where workers are essentially in control of the streets. And with the help of the Communist Party peasant associations, which of course, under the bloc within, they're also Kuomintang peasant associations, the KMT is actually able to defeat imperialist-backed warlords who are in control of Guangdong, and they're able to consolidate this key province in southern China and build a base that they hope they're going to be able to use to unify the entire country. In essence, there was a situation of dual power developing. You had the KMT national government trying to establish a bourgeois republic, and you had workers in Shanghai and Guangzhou developing embryonic Soviets, which represented an alternative, incipient workers' government. Now, I don't want to exaggerate. The workers were still too weak to overthrow the national government. They were not really able to establish their own power, but what was necessary in this situation was firm revolutionary leadership. First and foremost, the communists needed to patiently explain to the workers that you cannot rely on the bourgeoisie. You cannot rely on their party, the Kuomintang. You have got to recognize the situation of dual power. And above all, dual power is an unstable situation. It cannot last forever. Either the bourgeois national government was going to smash the workers and smash their embryonic Soviets, or the workers were going to strengthen their Soviets, link up with peasant Soviets in the countryside, soldiers Soviets inside the KMT's National Revolutionary Army, and sweep the national government away. But the Comintern leadership actually counseled the CCP to do exactly the opposite. Instead of recognizing the real situation on the ground, they said there was no potential for conflict between the mass movement of the workers and the bourgeois national government. In March of 1926, the Comintern said that a, quote, Kuomintang government, or a people's government, closely resembling the Soviet system, was founded in Guangzhou on July 1st, 1925. So in essence, what they're saying is, no, you don't have two different powers based on two different classes, one of which is going to destroy the other. No, no, no. The power of the working class is completely aligned with the power of the national government. And in fact, the national government is creating a system closely resembling the Soviet system. But the class enemy actually understands the real situation much better than the Comintern bureaucrats. They knew that even though the Communist Party was acquiescing, that's not enough to secure class peace. For one, they didn't really believe the communist leaders when they said, oh, you've got to support the Kuomintang. They thought it was all a big trick. But even if it hadn't been, for the bourgeoisie, the existence of workers and peasants in the countryside who are armed, who are workers who are in control of the streets, that is a threat to their property, and they are not going to feel safe until that threat is smashed. All they needed was to find the man to do it, and they found it in the shape of Chiang Kai-shek. This guy was a petty gangster turned general. He was a close associate of Sun Yat-sen, who had died a couple of months before the revolution began. And on March 20th, 1926, Chiang launched a coup in Guangzhou against both the Communist Party and the left wing of his own party. He arrested hundreds of communists. He raided the strikers' headquarters. He placed the Kuomintang's Soviet advisors under house arrest. This was basically a declaration of war by the forces of counter-revolution against the forces of revolution. So how did the forces of revolution respond to this declaration of war? Well, Stalin suppressed news of the coup d'etat. He hid it from the rest of the Communist International for over a year. And how was he able to do that? Well, basically, the official line of the Comintern and of the Communist Party was, there are these counter-revolutionaries. They're spreading rumors that there's been a coup in Guangzhou. But it's not true. They're only trying to break up the revolutionary alliance between the communists and the Kuomintang. And so instead of mobilizing the masses against the coup regime, they made a new deal with the Kuomintang. Basically, they gave more concessions. They said the Kuomintang leaders can review all Central Committee decisions. They gave the KMT leaders the names of all the communists who were in the KMT as part of the bloc within. After his successful coup, Chiang launched a northern expedition. This was a military campaign to try to unify the rest of the country under the national government. And what did the Soviets do to this man who had just carried out a coup against the communists in Guangzhou? Well, they gave him more arms. They gave him more weapons to fight this to fight this campaign. And this campaign was essentially progressive, right? The idea of unifying all of China was a progressive thing, and the Communist Party should have supported it. And they should have said to the workers and the peasants, look, you cannot rely on the KMT and its NRA to unify the country. You've got to rise up and with your own power, with your own arms, you've got to unify the country. And in fact, that's exactly what workers and peasants did. They rose up in anticipation of the army. Anytime the army would get close to an area, there would be a workers' uprising in the city or a peasant uprising in the countryside. And by 1927, in February, the NRA reached the outskirts of Shanghai, which is the key city in northern China. And you know, the general strike in Shanghai in 1925 had been broken by this point by imperialist gunboats and warlord armies assisted by some white Russian mercenaries. But with the advance of the NRA northward, the workers were roused again. The General Labor Union, which had been founded by the communists, launched 2 general strikes. The first in February of 1927, second one in March. And the March 21st general strike involved over 800,000 workers. And this is almost the entire working class of Shanghai. And in this uprising, or in this general strike, it becomes very quickly an insurrection, right? The workers arm themselves. They break into police stations and barracks and grab weapons. And within 2 days, they had swept the warlord government out of the city. And were in control of the streets. Over the next 3 weeks, GLU membership exploded from 350,000 to 850,000 workers. Basically, almost every worker in Shanghai joined the union. But the slogans that were raised in this insurrection reflected the confusion that the Communist Party was sowing in the working class. The slogans were, "Hail the National Revolutionary Army, welcome Chiang Kai-shek." Now, this was exactly the time for the Communist Party to say, no, 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 no. Don't hail the National Revolutionary Army. Don't welcome Chiang Kai-shek. This is the man who launched a counter-revolutionary coup against you in Guangzhou. This is the time for the communists to have called on the entire working class of China to rise up, to say, look what the workers have done in Shanghai. You should take control in your own cities. Just like the Shanghai workers have done. And I have no doubt that if they had made this call, even with all their errors, even with the bloc within, workers all over China, particularly in Guangzhou and Hong Kong, would have risen up and taken up the task. And the key to victory at that point would have been backing up these workers' uprisings with a peasant war. And the advance of the NRA northward was causing peasants to rise up and seize land from their landlords. But what was the Communist Party's response to this? They didn't say to the peasants, good, seize the land, form Soviets, you know, take power into your own hands. What they said was, don't seize the land, right? You have got to back the revolutionary program of the Kuomintang, which is for a reduction in rent and a cap on interest rates on loans of only 20% APR. So the fact of the matter was that the peasant movement was actually so militant that eventually the Communist Party leaders are forced to support some kind of land reform. So they end up saying, okay, you can seize the land, but only of the big landlords, not the small landlords. They're our allies in the struggle against the imperialists, but seize the land of the big landlords. But also, you can't seize the land of generals in the NRA, because they're our allies. They're our revolutionary allies in this struggle. And you can't seize the land of their families, who are, of course, our allies as well. And this is a problem because basically every general in the NRA is a big landowner. And, you know, so many landowners are members have members of their families who are, you know, generals or high-ranking officers in the NRA. Trotsky actually at this time had very different advice for the Chinese Communist Party. And I'm gonna read a kind of longish quote of what he advocated, and I will ask you to take note of how he thought the Communist Party should deal with KMT generals. He said, "Build up your workers' Soviets, ally them with peasant Soviets, arm yourselves, draw soldiers' representatives into the Soviets, shoot the generals who do not recognize the Soviets, shoot the bureaucrats and bourgeois liberals who will organize uprisings against the Soviets. Only through peasant and workers' Soviets will you win over the majority of Chiang Kai-shek's soldiers to your side." And winning over the majority of the soldiers was the key question, because Chiang Kai-shek is waiting on the outskirts of Shanghai, which is under control of the workers, and he wants to move in and smash them, but he's not sure that he can rely on his army. The first NRA units to enter Shanghai actually fraternized with the workers. And Zhang needed to replace them with new units that he thought would be loyal. And so he orders them out of the city. And these soldiers, they refuse to leave. The rank and file soldiers actually forced their commanding officer to go to the Chinese Communist Party leaders and say, look, Chiang Kai-shek has ordered us out of the city because he wants to come in here and smash you. We want to stay and fight. If you tell us to stay and fight, we will stay and help you fight. And what does the CCP do with this information? They say, no. You follow your orders. You leave the city. And they actually sold out the commander who had told them about this. And they said to Chiang Kai-shek, this guy's plotting against you. You got to look out for this guy. And so the workers are disarmed both politically and physically when Zhang finally moves in at 4 a.m. on April 12th, 1927. So on that morning in Shanghai, the NRA, assisted by gangster elements and with the support of foreign imperialists, began slaughtering thousands of communists and Communist Party sympathizers. As many as 10,000 were killed. It was the beginning of a counter-revolutionary white terror that spread to cities across China. The Second Chinese Revolution was, for all intents and purposes, over. Peasant uprisings continued in the countryside, but the Chinese workers' movement was completely broken. So what really is there to say about the revolution? First and foremost, I think the Chinese Revolution of 1925 to 27 stands as one of the most obnoxious crimes of Stalinism. And the Stalinists learned absolutely nothing from it. After the Shanghai massacre, they declare our perspectives were proven entirely correct. And in fact, there was a left wing of the Kuomintang, which had been overthrown in the March 26th coup. They had regrouped in Wuhan. And basically what the Stalinists said was that the perspective was proven entirely correct. The only difference is now the left wing in Wuhan, they are our allies in the national struggle. They're the leadership of the national bourgeoisie, and they basically oriented to them in the exact same way as they had once oriented to Chiang Kai-shek. Now, of course, there were some in China, including Chen Duxiu, who learned the lessons of the revolution. And Chen went on to be an important leader of the left opposition in China. Now, as Lenin and Trotsky had predicted, the Chinese bourgeoisie was unable to lead the Chinese Revolution. Jiang failed to reunify the country. He did for a moment. He got various warlords and people to kind of all swear allegiance and raise the Kuomintang flag, but it didn't last, and China suffered another generation of warlordism, imperialist domination. And anybody who knows about the 30s and 40s in China knows that it was an extremely bloody generation. So really, what can be said of this tragedy? I would say history wastes nothing. Revolutionary victories as well as revolutionary defeats serve as valuable lessons which every communist cadre must strive to assimilate. Having produced positive proof of the theory of permanent revolution in Russia in 1917, history then furnished us with negative proof of the same theory in China between 1925 and 27. The millions of Chinese workers and peasants who struggled and sacrificed to free themselves from imperialist domination cannot fail to inspire future generations, not just in China, but around the world. 100 years after the revolution began, the Chinese working class is 50 times larger than it was back then, and its importance in the world economy is second to none. And I don't think anybody should be in any doubt that when that Chinese working class moves, when it is guided by genuine Marxism and Leninism rather than bankrupt Stalinism, it will astonish and astound the 21st century more completely than it did the 20th. And marching side by side with their class brothers and sisters around the world, they will bury world capitalism once and for all. Thank you, comrades.
Communists of America is a podcast produced by our party, the Revolutionary Communists of America. If you agree with what was said in this podcast and you want to get organized, go to communistusa.org/join.
changes. We are living in a world of extreme crisis and turmoil with sudden and sharp shifts. At every level, society is experiencing upheavals on a daily basis. Now, the point of this podcast is not to accumulate a heap of facts following every thread of this development, and neither is it to find interesting angles that can make us look clever, if we do. But it is to follow events closely in order to find the underlying processes in society. Why? So that we can arm a new generation of communists and revolutionaries with an understanding of the society we are living in, so that we can change it. My name is Hamid Alizadeh. I'm here today with Jorge Martin. Welcome back to the second season of Against the Stream. Jorge, here we are again.
Yes.
We started this about less than a year ago, October last year.
Yeah.
In a meeting room with a phone in front of us.
That's right. It was an X Spaces, wasn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And here we are with a modernized studio, Studio Mark II. We've had a break for about 2 months, I think. And in that break, we've had lots of things happening. We have been at the World Congress of the Revolutionary Communists International, where we discussed the main developments in the world today and developed a strategy, a tactic for building our organization.
Yes, there was actually an uproar of protest when the break for the podcast was announced, and I've had comrades all over the summer saying, "When are you coming back? When are you coming back?" So, yeah. The World Congress of the Revolutionary Communist International took place in Italy at the beginning of August. And yes, one of the main points of discussion, the discussion centered mainly around this question of the developments in world relations, the rise of China, the relative decline of the United States. And we discussed it at quite some length and from many different angles. There was some interesting discussions about, for instance, the struggle for the Arctic, the question of Chinese development in top technology industries. But also, we discussed quite a lot about the crisis in Europe, isn't it? There was comrades who spoke about the crisis of capitalism in Germany, in France, in Spain, in Britain. I thought it was a very good meeting because, as you say, lots of things are happening, lots of things are changing, and we need to understand what are the processes behind all of this.
Yes.
And the purpose of understanding is not just for our own intellectual gratification, but because we are building a revolutionary organization that can intervene in these events and change the course of history.
Yes, precisely. With that said, I think we should dive in. We have a lot of interesting material today. A lot has happened in the past couple of months. We can't comment on all of it, unfortunately. We will do that in the next weeks and months. In particular, Israel and its onslaught on Gaza. We'll have to deal with another time. But we will be discussing Donald Trump, the crisis of American imperialism, the rise of China. Again, one of the main characteristics of the world situation today. One of the most prominent factors. The decline of Europe, the crisis of Europe, the rising class struggle, and also revolutionary events in Indonesia, which is obviously a very important country in Asia. But let's start with Trump, or let's start with China. We had the military parade in China 2 days ago. Was it yesterday? 2 days ago. And when you see headlines about China, there's kind of two kind of how do you say
strands.
right? One is the kind of lesser papers, the ones who are looking for more kind of sensationalist headlines. They're all, the rise of China, this and that. And then the more sober kind of capitalist bourgeois who are more saying, well, it's not really something to worry about. And, you know, in the main papers are not that China mongering, right? But this military parade was big and was very significant, and I could sense a sense of panic when you were reading the bourgeois media, all of them, Financial Times, The Economist. I mean, we'll get to that later. The Foreign Policy wrote an article saying China's military is now leading. That's a warning sign coming from a pretty prominent established magazine. But this was a in a way, this was a culmination of everything that's been taking place in world relations in the past 2 months. A lot has happened because it started off, I can't remember if this was before we went on break or not, but Trump issuing an ultimatum on Putin, saying you got 50 days to reach some sort of an agreement in Ukraine, otherwise.
No, otherwise
slap
he did.
tariffs.
Yeah, he did threaten with secondary tariffs.
Secondary tariffs, 100% tariffs, and hail and brimstone, as they say. Then he changed it to say, oh no, he's got 10 or 12 days. And before that was over, he organized a summit with Putin. Big, so we're going to reach a deal now. That big things are happening. And coming out of that, he did actually impose a series of sanctions, but in particular on India, where he slapped 25% tariffs on top of the already 25% tariffs that they've slapped on India previously.
As a punishment for India continuing to trade with Russia, and particularly India resells Russia's oil onto the world market.
Precisely. And after all of this posturing, after all of these threats and attacks, what happens is that we have this military day parade. Who's there? There's Putin, Xi Jinping. This came after a week of meetings in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was an organization that existed for some years. It's not been that prominent for anyone but China. But this time around, who was there? Putin was there. Modi was there. The Iranian president was there. Kim Jong-un was there. Erdogan was there. Vucic, I believe, from Serbia was there. Fico was there.
From
Slovakia, and many others. Armenia and Azerbaijan. Trump says that he was the one who, got this peace deal through between both of those presidents were there, and in fact, rather than negotiating with the Americans and appease and kind of bending to the pressure that Trump put, the Indians in particular have looked the other way.
Yes.
They say that the Americans keep calling Modi, but he's not.
This was
not picking up the phone.
headline in the Telegraph that since these tariffs were imposed on China, these retaliatory tariffs, Trump has called Modi 4 times.
Not on China, on India.
Sorry, on India.
Yes.
Trump has called Modi 4 times, and he hasn't picked up. And
So we're going to end on that note. Normally, I would do some reading and meditation, but I got to go to bed in 45 minutes, and I got to shower and eat and wind down. So I just did my daily routine where I did some martial arts with my partner. We did some sparring. I taught my partner how to pin somebody's hand to their chest and throw an elbow over, and then they immediately cut my eyebrow, and I was very proud of them for that. That was nice. It was quickly done. And then, I did a 30-minute run, and then 30 minutes of solo martial arts and bodyweight exercise drill, which I started live streaming that, and then 30 minutes or so of yoga. And then normally I would do, like I said, some reading and some meditation on a podcast or an audiobook. I don't believe in meditating on some imaginary nonsense. We need to meditate on the real world and how we can change it and make it better, because this is the only life we get. So have a good night, and I will see you.